Hey everyone, this is smpratte, and today we're going to talk about if we are in a buyer's market. Naturally, with the meteoric rise we experienced in 2020 and then some of these cards cooling off a bit, a lot of people are asking, is this a buyer's market? And I think it's actually good to separate this between English and Japanese because I think overall English is in general more of a buyer's market than Japanese right now. I think it's tough to just say a yes or no overall because there's so many different releases within Pokemon. There's so many cards, whether it's like a PCL or a Players Club Celebi or whatever card it is, that have mixture of rarity, availability, great ability. There's so many variables that go into it. So it's tough to just say, yeah, it's all in a buyer's market. But in general, I do think right now there's a lot more competition with English. There's a lot more availability with English. There's a lot more supply with English. And that's because basically the exposure in 2020 really funneled into mostly English. I would say overall, the Japanese side of the hobby was really unaffected. Again, if we're doing Scantron answers here, overall, I think yes, the Japanese market was hardly affected by like the Logan Paul or whoever it is. Any of those streamers on Twitch or whatever cool new things happening. I don't think that affected the majority of the Japanese market, which is why in Patreon I was screaming from the top of the mountain how pretty much everything in Japanese was underrated because it barely had any additional exposure. But the opportunity cost of that is during that exposure for English, the opportunity was on the front end. If you had those cards, if you had the first edition base or the WotC, whatever it was, already graded in hand, you could sell into that new demand. So why you had such a sharp uptick is because, as most people know, you had a previous supply based on a lower previous demand and then a sharp uptick on demand with that same supply. Naturally, that's going to create higher prices. And now because of that, everybody and their dog are going after the accessible cards. When that Logan Paul video showed up on their front page or BuzzFeed article, or whatever it is that they tune into, what did they do? They went to the accessible options, which were their closet or the store. And that's what they did. They went and found those cards, and that's why you have a huge uptick in those two categories. And I've hinted at this over and over and over and over again. During 2020, right after 2020, in the middle of everyone frustrated or just gobsmacked like how crazy prices were. And I remember just saying, like, what do you think is going to be in the backlog? What do you think is going to come from all this? Which cards are going to be the ones that are going to hit the market? And sure enough, we're starting to see that data now really develop, and it's proven to be mostly mid-grade WotC, mid to high grade, somewhere in there. Like if it's anything from PSA 4 to like 7 or something like that, and then pretty much everything English Modern, because English Modern is literally being printed at right now as we speak. It's still going. Even in Shining Fates and things like that, it's still available at distributors. So those are your obvious two answers. So another thing to talk about with English is that during this process of exposure, there's no barrier of entry. Where with Japanese, there's a bit more of a barrier. Where something like this PCL card, you look at it, you're like, okay, there's no Pokemon in it. It's a trainer card. Like, what's going on? Someone who's just getting back into it, this is going to be like chapter 5. Like, they're not going to read that right out of the gate. They're going to have to learn some of the vocabulary to get into the Japanese stuff. And that's the beauty of this huge volatility you experience in English. In Japan, it just stayed steady. And there's a lot to unpack with that. It's not just the 2020 exposure. There's a lot more details and reasons why the Japanese market has been pretty much consistent for 25 years. And a big one of those is that barrier to entry. Even for people like me, I still have to go through and, you can only search on some websites in Japanese. You gotta remember what are the characters, what do I have to Control C, Control V to search these cards. There's always a learning curve when you're searching for these Japanese items. But on top of that, even if you had a one-to-one, like if we created a perfect, like, situation in a lab where you had the exact same amount of cards printed in English and the exact same amount in Japan, the same release for a set or whatever it is, the Japanese market acts differently. So even if you had the exposure and everything else, in general, on average, Japanese sellers are a lot more patient. When I say that you got a discount or you bargain with a Japanese seller, that doesn't make any sense. That's like saying cayenne pepper isn't spicy. Like, it's one of those things that just makes absolutely no sense because in Japan, most of the time, sellers don't bargain. In fact, there's like a famous quote that's like a meme now. It's just absolute art. Maybe you can make it into an NFT and stonk it. But it's just an absolute beauty of a quote from a Japanese seller in Yahoo Japan when someone was like, hey, can I buy this item, at this price? like at a discount, and they responded and said, go buy from another seller at that price. So that's the Japanese market in a nutshell. There's a big contrast in the behavior over there, and if you want to say culture and the standard of practice over there and how they sell things, there's not as much of a race to the bottom as there is in the US. And that doesn't mean it's all good or vice versa, it's all bad, because each one of these has their own like skill set or opportunity costs. And in the case of the race to the bottom right now, it's great for buyers. Talking about the original topic 8 minutes later about if it's a buyer's market, it does create a buyer's market situation when a bunch of people are competing and adding all the supply to the market. But again, it's mainly in these categories that are really accessible, low barriers to entry. Even within English, things like Art Academy or anything with any type of rarity or legs to it, you just can't optimize that. It doesn't matter how many Logan Paul videos are made. That doesn't just automatically create more of something that's inherently rare. So there are definitely plenty of examples of items that have, not just Pitfall, that have held their price or perhaps increased as well. But overall, those major categories of mid-grade WotC and English Modern, they're so accessible. There's a race to a bottom culture in the US. You have all the bots and everyone just competing and crawling over each other to flip, rip, dip. And that's what you're getting right now. So that's what's going on, I think, overall. And, just to add to that, when we're talking about like the backlog and what to expect and what's to come, because I think everyone's always trying to look forward naturally. We're trying to figure out what's tomorrow going to bring, what's a month from now or a year from now going to look like. And I think it all goes back to the backlog. That question I was posing to people back in 2020 when we were in the thick of it. And, when PSA first shut down and, all this stuff was at the height, I remember suggesting to people, you think it's going to be a tropical wind over the Chunky Dunkies here? Do you think it's going to be a Unicarp or Trophy Kangaskhan? What's going to be in the backlog? What's really going to be in that backlog? Now, I do think there's going to be plenty of Japanese cards. Don't hear this as a binary. It's not like, oh, there's no Japanese in there. Yeah, there's going to be some birthday Pikachus, Shining Mews, Koros, go down the line. I just don't think you're going to see that in mass as much as you will, things like unlimited WotC. When I have people, everyone likes to quote or cherry pick that quote from the 1920s, about the shoe shiners. When the shoe shiners giving you advice about your investments, that's when you know what's in a bubble. Everyone likes to cherry pick that now. And when I think about that and translate it to real life today, when I have all my friends and family and everyone showing me their cards, what does that tell me? Does that mean the whole market's in a bubble? I think what it tells me is that these cards are probably going to be the worst offenders. They're probably going to create the biggest buy opportunity, or at least the lowest price if you're trying to collect them or do whatever with it. That's what I mean by buy opportunity. It's going to really increase that supply. I think that's the correct translation for people who are always trying to pontificate about the shoe shiner analogy. Like, how does that translate to today, 100 years later? And I think that's really the answer there, is that when everybody and their dog is sending me photos of their childhood collections, or they're in the store and they're like, hey, is this the right set to buy? Is this one going to make me money? That's the stuff that I think is going to be the worst offender. And you're already seeing that. And I'm probably preaching to the choir, like a lot of people who are on the grind and hustle and they're here, subscribe to the Grandma House and Patreon, and they're doing the whole nine. I'm sure this is just, par for the course for them. But, anybody new watching or anybody new to the game, I think that's the overall prediction, or where we are right now in the market, is that the buyer's market definitely is more on the English side of things. And for Japanese, it's been pretty consistent. Yeah, you had certain things like maybe Japanese base, but even then, when I say that, in the past week alone, I've sold like over 25 non-holo Japanese base cards, like instantly, like right after listing them. So, the demand's there, and I think it also ties back into, again, the culture of Japan and how they sell. Japanese sellers tend to never barter. There's a lot of barriers to entry, even the language. Like, you just can't directly talk to them. So maybe even some of them would be willing to barter, but there's just no way to directly communicate because, again, these barriers are in place. So if you think of it like in a physical way of like this flood of exposure as water, when there's no barriers there for English, it's just going to flood right on in. Where in Japan, they have so many levees and gates and barriers that's to go through, they really didn't get hit with that wave of exposure. So I think that's the general breakdown on what's going on right now. To answer that question of, is it a buyer's market? Again, Scantron, yes, I think for English a lot of it is going to be this way, and I'm sure there's going to be plenty of cards that we haven't hit the bottom yet. Some of them the dagger's still falling, some of them the inflection point is already hit and they've already recovered, or at least held or remain. And again, some English cards that have great fundamentals, difficulty to grade, very scarce, very rare, those weren't affected. Just like anything in Japanese or anything in anything literally, like in the world that's rare or difficult to achieve is always typically impossible to optimize. So yeah, that's held its head above this increased tide of supply. So that's what I have for It's a Buyer's Market. Always a fun topic to talk about. There's always a lot to go into. I'll try to do sealed in a separate video. I'm still trying to figure out like how I'm gonna make that into its own video because a lot has changed since 2020 for sealed product, both Japanese and English. So you'll probably see that in the near future. But this is what I have mainly for singles, created cards, and yeah, that's my take. But as usual, guys, you know the deal. Let me know how you feel. That's pretty much it. Till next time.